So one of the very first videos I ever made on the channel was on John Mayer's Overdrive history, and I did a timeline from the very early days of Room for Squares all the way until present day at the time of making that video. And since it's been a few years since that original video came out, we've had lots of tours and individual shows since then, as well as just in general, a lot more information has surfaced on John's gear usage over the years. I thought, why not remake that video and update it and improve upon it, and just in general have a bit of a deeper discussion into some of the different usage of overdrive pedals that John's had throughout the years. And keeping in mind to you guys that this video isn't going to be every single overdrive that John has used over the years. If I did that, we'd be here for way longer than we're going to be already and as it is, but we're definitely covering more than just the basis from the mainline tours and everything like that. We're going to be covering lots of special, different, pedals that have come in and out throughout the years as well, but definitely I'm not going to be covering or intending on covering every single small little instance. So if there's anything I do leave out in the video, leave a comment down below as to why this is maybe one of your favorite performances or something, but if it's left out, there's probably a pretty good reason as to why. And with that all said, let's dive right on into John Mayer's Overdrive pedal history and our timeline. So of course, we're going to go all the way back to the Room for Squares era. And there's, a lot of great performances from this era, but I think the one that everyone really goes back to is Covered in Rain from Any Given Thursday. That's certainly a highlight performance from this era. Now, the main kind of overdrive pedal everyone knows John to have used is a tube screamer. And all the way back in this era, we have the TS9DX as being kind of the earliest tube screamer we can really point to John using in his career as we've kind of gotten to know it. So we have the TS9DX, and then as well, we have a shot of his pedal board where you can kind of make out a pedal with 3 knobs on it. It's got a bit of red and yellow on it as well, and then a switch on the far right side. Now, back in the early 2000s, my understanding is that on, I think it was John Mayer's website, he had a list of all the gear he kind of was using or had at that point. I don't know, I was way too young at that point to have ever actually gone on and looked at that stuff, but that's my understanding of it. And this is kind of where the theory of the Menatone Red Snapper first came up, because the pedal's kind of, format matches in line with what we see in some of the images like this one here. However, that theory has kind of changed, and now the leading theory, at least, is that it's the Menatone Miss Foxy Brown. You can kind of see that the pedal has some of the yellow on it that matches up with the artwork on the Menatone Miss Foxy Brown, and you can find those 3 knob versions that line up exactly with what this pedal kind of seems to be. So leading theory for that is the Menatone Miss Foxy Brown, kind of being that lighter overdrive. I believe it's based on kind of the brown face Fender sound, which definitely would be a very interesting pedal to try out. It's something that I'm sure would sound really great in kind of a Mayer-y overdrive sound context, but that and the TS9DX is your overdrive combination for the early Room for Squares and Any Given Thursday tone. Now this brings us along to the Heavier Things era, and the Heavier Things era was the one era of John's that we initially knew the least about. And this is mainly due to the fact that John took the traditional pedal board setup, threw all of his pedals into a rack unit, and then started using a custom audio electronics Bradshaw switching system in front of him on the floor. We never had great shots of the rack or even the switcher just to know from the labels what he was using, and this is kind of a time frame where, you just don't get a lot of great photos, unfortunately. So we had little tidbits of information to go off of and base what we knew John was using at this time frame. Now, however, we've kind of discovered 2 semi-rare magazines actually that did some different rig rundowns, kind of rig reviews of John's from this time frame. The first one is a Japanese exclusive magazine from January 28th of 2004. The other I physically have in front of me. It's Guitar Player from February of 2004, and cool story, that guitar on the cover is the same guitar that you see on the cover of Heavier Things, so maybe I'll do a video discussing that specific guitar at a later date. But you'd think because this magazine is February of 2004 and the Japanese one is January 28th of 2004, there would be some consistency between the gear that you see, especially due to the overdrive pedals, which is what we're discussing in today's video, but there isn't. Now, what makes my job a little bit more difficult is the fact that the February 2004 guitar player interview was obviously done before February of 2004, but there's no actual date that the interview was done that they provide, which is a little frustrating, and they don't have shots of the actual rack unit or the gear or anything. They just provide a list. So this interview doesn't really help us out, unfortunately. They kind of dropped the ball a little bit on everything in this actual interview. The Japanese one is where we get the best information from in the actual shots, which you're seeing here. Now, the issue with the consistency between these two things is that from the Japanese magazine, it lists the Full-Tone Full Drive 2 and the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark 1. And in the shot here that you can actually see of the rack unit, you can make out, or at least we can try and make out what version of Full-Tone Full Drive 2 John was using. However, the Guitar Player magazine, dated February of 2004, only states the Full-Tone Full Drive 2. So was this done before end of January of 2004? I'm obviously willing to bet that the interview was done before that, because that's basically February at that point. So they would have interviewed John before then to get the magazine out in time for February. So what I'm trying to piece together for you guys in terms of the Heavier Things era is John first started off with the Full-Tone Full Drive 2 and then added the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark 1 at a later date. Now, I think I can be pretty confident in stating that kind of timeline in terms of the Heavier Things era, just because we know that this was the Tanny Public Hall, is what the translation states, for January 28th of 2004. Like I said, the interview that would have made it into the February magazine would have surely been before that point in order to get it actually printed, edited, and thrown in the magazine. So what we can kind of gather, Full-Tone Full Drive 2 is added in, and the version here, because we can see from the actual shot of the rig, it looks like it's one of the early 2000s custom shop versions of the Full Drive 2. The earlier kind of late 90s versions had those black caps on the switches, and from what I can tell at least, the boost side, the right side LED was kind of that lighter green, almost yellow, not the red, which we can see the one that John has in the rack unit. And that appears to be consistent with those kind of early 2000s versions, just in case you're trying to find out which version John was actually using of the Full Drive 2. That's what I can at least tell from this. I'm not an expert on the Full Drive and the different versions or things Mike Fuller did, but those are kind of two things I've noticed that appear to be pretty consistent in terms of the late 90s to the early 2000s kind of transition point of the Full Drive 2. Then he added in the Marshall Bluesbreaker at a later point, again kind of gain stacking there, but started off at least with just the Full Drive 2, which is kind of interesting, going from two overdrive pedals to the one, from at least what I'm trying to piece together. Now, on June 19th of 2004, Last Call with Carson Daly, John would perform Come Back to Bed solo with a few pedals just in front of him. Very much John Mayer solo tour vibes looking back at this early performance. He did some looping with the Line 6 DL4, and for the solo, he had one overdrive pedal on the floor in front of him, and just from some screenshots and just really zooming in, I can tell that it is a Ibanez TS-808. So kind of interesting, in the middle of the Heavier Things era, John goes out and performs this TV performance solo and doesn't bring a Full-Tone Full Drive 2 with him, but brings a TS-808. Now, all of the TS-808 versions that we've seen that John has used, besides the Keeley modded version, which we're going to get in just a moment, have been a vintage model. Now this one, you can tell that the foot switch is the standard foot switch, so I'm gonna lean towards this being a vintage TS-808 that we see John using here. Not the Keeley modded version, it's not that, but everything indicates that it's a vintage version, but just something interesting to point out, and this is a standout performance from the Heavier Things era that I wanted to touch on, and seeing what we can kind of tell as being the earliest use of a TS-808 that we've ever seen John use. And this brings us right on to the John Mayer Trio era, my personal favorite era of John's. Now, these shots you are seeing here are from Joshua Bryant, and they are the third ever John Mayer Trio Tour show ever, which is really cool. So we're getting a look at kind of the early incarnation of the John Mayer Trio rig, which is certainly different from the one that we all kind of know. Now, the main thing here with these shots that you can see is the full tone full drive 2 has stayed. It's a different version this time. It's a blue one, but full tone full drive 2, and then the Keeley modded TS808. Now, from this shot here and kind of the early inception of the John Mayer Trio rig, we have a concept actually that we've discussed a lot more in terms of recent John Mayer tones, but certainly nothing as far back as the John Mayer Trio era, and that's stacking tube screamer pedals together, because the full tone full drive 2 is a tube screamer circuit, and then you can stack that with the TS808 Keeley modded version, and that's exactly what John has been doing lately, at the time of me making this video at least. So the concept of gain stacking tube screamers together to get a Mayer overdrive tone, or how John gets his overdrive tone, is certainly actually a concept that John's been doing right from the very early states and of his career. And we're going to get into that a little bit later on. There's a few other instances of this happening before kind of the more modern John Mayer Trio tones. But these are some really great shots of the John Mayer Trio era and kind of its earliest incarnation. Of course, as we move on to what we all know the John Mayer Trio rig to have been, we have the Keeley modded blues driver and the vintage TS808. When you think of John Mayer Trio, this really is kind of the main overdrive pedal setup that John used for the vast majority of the John Mayer Trio era. Now, of course, we know that the John Mayer Trio era served as the foundation for Continuum. And in this timeline history video, we really aren't going to be discussing the studio use of drive pedals, because it's really impossible to say for certain what appeared on any album, what John had in the studio, because he's got access to absolutely everything. If you watch the In Repair Making One Song One Day documentary, you saw that John had tables and tables of different pedals, the way huge ones, the vintage ones, my favorite from that kind of, overview, but he had everything to use, so it's very hard to say. But for Continuum specifically, we know that the John Mayer Trio pedal board served as that foundation in the studio, so at some point, are you hearing a Keeley modded blues driver and a vintage TS808 on the record? It's more likely, I'd say, than not. But there is this shot that we have here from the studio recording sessions of Continuum, where you can see John with the Trio pedal board, and as he's switching kind of things off and on the board, it looks like, in front of him on the floor is a King of Tone version 2, the 4-knob version with the 2 LEDs off to the right side. This is just a really cool shot that we have that I definitely did not want to leave out of this video, and we're going to be talking about the King of Tone, this version 2 model, a little later on in the video as well, but just worth noting that John did have it in the studio, and this shot exists, so I thought, why not mention it and highlight it in this video. And as since the John Mayer Trio era and sound served as that foundation for Continuum, we saw a lot of carryover from the pedals that John would use into the actual Continuum tour rack unit, because John did go back and switch to the Bradshaw unit again for the Continuum tour. And from this shot of the rack unit in early of 2007, you guys can see the Keeley modded blues driver, the vintage TS808, and the Marshall Blues Breaker Mark I. Now, on March 1st of 2007, John would perform Gravity on Letterman. Now, this is a very important performance because John on his pedal board, he had a traditional pedal board setup, but he had the vintage TS-808, what we assume would be vintage at least, and the Ibanez TS-10, the very earliest point we can say for certainty that John started using the TS-10. So, on the pedal board, the lead tone that you're going to be hearing in Gravity, and I'm going to do my best to actually be able to play you guys a clip of this performance in the video. You hear John step, and you actually see him step on the TS-10 first as the far left pedal, then the TS-808, you hear him step on it as the solo just builds at the very end of Gravity. But again, that concept of gain stacking tube screamer pedals together is in play here in the very first case of John using the TS-10.
Can that be? Just give me where the light is. Just keep me where the light is. Just keep me where the light is. Just keep me where the light is.
So March 1st of 2007 is the earliest we can pinpoint John using the TS-10, and the TS-10 would transition into the rack unit and to be used for the Continuum tour, replacing the TS-808. Now this shot of John's rack unit that we're looking at now is from September of 2008 and the Continuum summer tour. Now the run drawer you guys can see here has the TS-10, the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I, and the Mark I Bluesbreaker stayed in the rack unit the entire Continuum tour. That was the one real consistency here with John's overdrive usage during the Continuum era. You have a second TS-10 in kind of behind them, and then on the middle rack you have the Pete Cornish Duplex, which is an SS2 and G2 in one enclosure. Worth noting here, in every shot that we have from the Continuum tour, at least of the Duplex, only the SS2 side is on. Now, did John only use the SS2 side? It kind of looks that way, if we're being honest, because as you know, all of the pedals need to be on in order for the rack unit to actually work with the controller on the floor. So is it just a coincidence that all the shots we have of the rack unit only show that one side on, or is it more likely that that's just the one side John was using? Probably the latter, right? But in behind the Pete Cornish Duplex, we have a third Ibanez TS-10. Now, why there were this many in the rack unit at the time, it's really difficult to say. Was John using different, were they looped into different presets, or were they all backups? I don't know. But the one kind of mystery about the Continuum tour is that every pedal on the Bradshaw controller on the floor had a label for what the pedal kind of actually was, more or less, but there were three stickers: a yellow one, a green one, and kind of a reddish pink one. Now, what you guys can see here in this one shot is that the Bluesbreaker has the green sticker on it, the TS-10 beside it has a yellow sticker on it, but no pink sticker exists that I've ever been able to see. Now, this brings out the theory that there was a third overdrive that John was using, and it certainly seems likely because there were two other TS-10s and the Pete Cornish Duplex that John could have pulled from at least just this shot here from September of 2008. So was John just using stickers instead of labels on the floorboard so that he just knew green meant light overdrive, yellow meant the tube screamer sound, and then pink, kind of red, whatever it was, meant the third overdrive to stack with or whatever he was experimenting with, and that was easier than just swapping out the labels from TS-808 to TS-10 to whatever. Who knows? And what you guys might also be thinking at this point, we're talking about Continuum, 2007, 2008, what about Where the Light Is? And unfortunately, everything we just talked about applies to Where the Light Is. We have no idea for certain what John was actually using in terms of the overdrive pedals, and especially when, but it's safe to say that the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I was there, and I'd be very willing to bet kind of the farm that it was the TS-10, because we know John started using the TS-10 in March of 2007. So there was lots of time between then and Where the Light Is was actually filmed to get the TS-10 crossed over into the rack unit. So I'd say it's pretty much guaranteed the TS-10 is what you hear as well. That third overdrive slot is very hard to say. There is kind of a theory, or maybe some wishful thinking, that the BD2, the Keeley modded BD2 blues driver, was in the rack unit, especially with John performing John Mayer trio songs. for a film performance, the keenly modded blues driver would kind of make sense, but we have no way of saying without any, real certainty. However, we are not done when it comes to the Continuum era as we start to transition into the Battle Studies era. We have one more shot of the rack unit here with a lot of changes. And this was kind of in that crossover period, as I mentioned, between Continuum and Battle Studies, late 2008 from what I can gather here, because some of these images in here we don't have confirmation on exactly when they actually are, but just piecing together the timelines here, this is all kind of, as you guys are going to see, what makes the most sense. So in the rack unit here, we have the multiple TS10s are dropped. We have one TS10, the Marshall Blues Breaker with that green sticker still on it. Then on the same drawer, instead of that other TS10, we have the Smoky Signal Tubeless Overdrive, a pedal that we'll talk a lot more about later on in the video, but John's first kind of use of this pedal was during that later Continuum era. In the middle rack drawer, we have that P Cornish duplex again, and then on the top drawer, we actually have an original Hermidia Audio Zen Drive. Very, very interesting combination of pedals here. The Zen Drive and the Smoky Signal Tubeless being two ones that we really don't know exactly the context of how John has ever used these pedals, if I'm being absolutely honest. Now, our next shot here is one that was posted to John's Twitter account back in the day before he deleted it during his whole kind of, spent some time away from the media and everything. And this is a floorboard shot, and we know that this is kind of that transitionary period between Continuum and Battle Studies, mainly because of that buddy guy wah that is on the floor there. That is the key here into piecing together when that rack unit shot was, because if you look at the controller and you really zoom in, you can see that the Smoky Signal Tubeless actually has a label that says Smoky on it on the rack unit, and then in the top left you see Zen for the Zen Drive. So this is how we're piecing together that this is that kind of later 2008 period before we get into Battle Studies. So John's starting to see some experimentation with his overdrive pedals that he is using. Like I said, we have no idea exactly the context as to when and, how often he actually used these pedals, unless we get a really clear shot maybe from this time frame of John stepping on that far top left button that we know is the Zen Drive. We probably, unfortunately, will never know exactly the context that those incredibly rare and sought after pedals were actually used by him. Alright, now in 2009, as Continuum ended, we have a few really great performances we're going to highlight here. The first is on April 6th of 2009, the John Mayer Trio would perform on Conan, California Dreamin', and this is one of my favorite Mayer tones ever. It's absolutely fantastic. And for this performance, John just had a few pedals on the floor in front of him, the first one being the Ibanez TS10, and the second being the Klon Centaur, and as far as I'm aware, this is the earliest we can go back and actually see John using the Klon Centaur. So really cool to have kind of an early look at him using that pedal right kind of before Battle Studies and the Klon becomes that mainstay light overdrive pedal. I really wish I could show you guys a clip of the California Dreamin' performance because the tones are incredible if you haven't seen it already. It's one of those videos that just gets absolutely nuked from YouTube anytime you really try and upload it. It's happened to me a few times and just taken my whole video down. So as this is an hour and some long video, I'm not gonna risk it. Then on August 9th of 2009, John kind of performed a pop-up show at the Troubadour with the trio, and the pedal board here is one that I originally thought was a version of one of the boards John was using for the end of 2009 trio run of shows that they did, because everything kind of lined up. The Alessandro cabinet's the exact same carpet, the Buddy Guy wah, the same pedal train, everything lined up with exactly what we end up seeing to be the rig for the 2009 end of the year trio show runs. So I figured maybe John was just experimenting with different pedals and kind of different incarnations depending on the specific show, because this shot here, I could only ever trace it back until a Tumblr post from 2013 that was all in Japanese. That was the only thing I could ever find and go back for. But now we know that this was actually for that August 9th Troubadour show, which was kind of like a secret show. It was a pop-up. They just kind of announced it day of. You show up and you get an incredible Mayor show kind of right before Battle Studies actually comes out, which is really, really cool to see. And this pedal board here is just super interesting because you see the Ibanez TS10, the Smoky Signal Tubeless Overdrive making another appearance, this time on just a physical pedal board of John's, and then the Klon Centaur, kind of making for one of the most unobtainium overdrive setups we've ever seen John use, the TS10, Klon Centaur, and Smoky Signal. And this is also kind of a setup for overdrive pedals that we'll see just a little bit later on in this video too, the Tube Screamer, the Smoky Signal, and the Klon Centaur. But the fact that we just know where the shot is actually from now, that specific show, that's just really awesome, because it's one of those things that always bugged me, is having this great shot with the Smoky Signal on it especially, but having no concrete context as to where this actually belonged in the grand scheme of things. We knew it was 2009 and 99.9% a trio show, just which one specifically, but it makes a little bit more sense that it would be the Troubadour because that wasn't part of that end of the year run of trio shows. So maybe not quite that level of experimentation, as you can see in the differences between the two pedalboard shots that we have. And as I mentioned, at the end of 2009, we have that end of the year run of trio shows. And then the pedal board we see for this one is a little bit different. It's kind of same core concepts, rig with the, everything. But this time we have the Klon Centaur, the TS10, and then the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I in that order, interestingly enough. And that is, as we're about to discuss, what we actually see during the Battle Studies tour.
Love out.
And now we are at the Battle Studies era, and we start to get more information around John's gear from this point moving forward. The mysteries aren't completely gone, and where's the fun in that? But we do have a lot more information and a lot more context that I can provide to you guys. So I'm sure you've all seen Premier Guitar's rig rundown on John's rig for the Battle Studies era, in that you can clearly see the Klon Centaur, the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I, and the TS10 in the rack unit, and of course labeled on the switching system.
A Bradshaw system, and what it is, it's a system that houses pedals or effects so that he can turn them on and off when he wants to, or have a combination of them on and off when he wants to. These drawers just slide out, and they house all of the pedals that he wants to use, and they're always on. They're never off. If they're off, then they won't be employed. So as you can see, all the red lights indicating that the power is on is there.
Now, one thing just in re-watching this rig rundown that I never paid attention to before was actually when Renee scrolls through the presets on the floorboard for the Bradshaw controlling system, because I always just assumed John would just primarily just step on whatever individual switches he wanted to activate things. But as you watch Renee go through the banks and the different presets, something I noticed is that at different times you see obviously what overdrive pedals are selected for the different presets for whatever song. And there was one that I thought was really interesting where you see just the Bluesbreaker and the Klon Centaur on without the TS10, just giving us some very concrete proof that John was even experimenting with just using the Klon Centaur and the Marshall Bluesbreaker together at certain points. What that was exactly for, it's pretty hard to say for certainty, but during the Battle Cities era, you'd be hearing John combining the Bluesbreaker and the Klon Centaur together, which is just pretty cool. It wasn't just the Klon Centaur or the Bluesbreaker with the TS-10 being used. There was some, mixing around going on that's very clear. And then, of course, the Bluesbreaker as well, just on its own, you'll have seen there. But just some more context and something cool I thought I'd point out as well. Of course, there would be another John Mayer Trio performance in 2010 for the Crossroads Festival. The pedal board set up there was just a few pedals on the floor, and in this performance you're hearing the TS-10 and the Klon Centaur, no third overdrive. And in 2011 for the Tiger Jam with Keith Urban, the shot of the pedal board we have here, well, what do you know? It features the Klon Centaur, the Smoky Signal tubeless overdrive, and the Ibanez TS-10. So that exact same kind of overdrive setup that we just were looking at for a trio show in 2009 still kind of translates into 2011 as well for that performance with Keith Urban. It's just another example of seeing that Smoky Signal tubeless overdrive. In 2012, there are two performances I want to highlight. On September 15th, John would join Frank Ocean on Saturday Night Live, and we have the hauntingly beautiful Pyramid solo. The drive pedals were a TS-10 and Klon Centaur, and then on December 15th of 2012, John would perform Going Down with the Rolling Stones and Gary Clark Jr., an all-time favorite Mayer tone of mine personally, and the drives again were TS-10 and Klon Centaur. Worth noting that for the main riff, John was using the TS-10, and then for the solo, he added on top of it the Klon Centaur. So TS-10 was the bass tone for Going Down with the Rolling Stones. All right, now at this point, we're into 2013, and we're going to be starting to talk about the Born and Raised and Paradise Valley era. And I say both of those as the same era because the gear more or less stayed the same, and it was all kind of supporting both kind of back-to-back albums that John would release. Now, during this time, John ditched the Bradshaw rig setup with a switcher and went back to a traditional pedal board for a mainline tour. And there were only two overdrive pedals that John would use during the Born and Raised and Paradise Valley era. You have the Klon Centaur, which fully kind of kicked off the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I at this point. And then you had a tube screamer, either the TS-808 or the TS-10. Now, from everything I can kind of tell, there might have been some experimentation and crossover between both of these tube screamers, but heavily in 2013, it's pretty consistently the TS-808. Then later on, you see the TS-10 making the return kind of in 2014. That's what I've kind of been able to gather. And there are two very kind of highlight standout kind of performances in 2013 I would like to highlight. In 2013, on April 12th and 13th, we have Crossroads Festival. John would perform with Keith Urban, and on that pedal board we also saw the Klon Centaur and the TS-808, but this was just a smaller kind of version of the pedal board. And then we moved to Slow Dancing on Letterman in August of 2013, the exact same pedal board John would use for the Born and Raised Paradise Valley tour. He brought the whole rig with him, actually. But then again, the tones from that performance, because that's a highlight slow dancing performance for a lot of people, were the Klon Centaur, which was actually used for the main solo, and then the TS-808 as well, which was added in for the outro solo. So a lot of people consider the TS-10 the kind of the main modern John Mayer overdrive pedal, but in 2013, that 808 really made a bit of a comeback, even just for 1 year. And in 2013 as well, there's one other really cool thing I just have to mention. We get some kind of backstage, behind the scenes footage from the very first kind of beginning of the Born and Raised tour in 2013. And during the footage, you see John by the drum set. He's taking some pedals out of a box, and he pulls out two different Vemoran pedals. One, I believe, is the Shanks, just based on the kind of the angled kind of enclosure of the pedal, and then the Jan Ray. So maybe in the multiverse of John Mayer kind of, overdrives, he would use the January and the Shanks maybe instead. But as we know, he never actually put those pedals onto a pedal board, and just assuming John owns kind of everything. But it's cool to actually see him get those pedals in. And if you haven't seen this kind of shot here, he pulls the pedals out and he's kind of like, okay. And then the footage moves on. But just really cool and something I wanted to point out, especially as we're going to talk about a specific Vemoran pedal a little later on in our timeline. Now from this time period as well, there exists this photo. We see on the floor in front of that Alessandro cabinet, there was a King of Tone, the version 2 with the 4 knobs that we saw during the kind of Continuum studio recording sessions, a TS-808, and a TS-10. Now, even just as absurd as it is, John's haircut, the glasses, everything indicates that this is during the Born and Raised in Paradise Valley era. And in 2014 as well, Barbra Streisand would release Come Rain or Come Shine, and we know John was on that song, and his pedal board included that King of Tone version 2, the 4-knob version, with the TS-10. So everything here from between that shot here of all the pedals on the floor, and then when we know John recorded that song with Barbra Streisand, some consistency there. So that was just a shot of John with some gear that I again wanted to add in this video for you guys. And we know it was around this time frame here, and then of course we would see the TS-10 and that King of Tone pop up in the Barbra Streisand music video. So kind of some indication here as well of some things. I apologize. Some of these shots that just exist in, you know, kind of our archives at this point, we actually have no actual source. It's either been scraped from the internet, can't find it in a Wayback Machine or anything like that, so hard to exactly place certain sources of certain images, unfortunately. Now in 2016, there are just a couple things as well I want to highlight before we get into the Search for Everything era. Now on October 1st, we have the Roots Picnic performance, and this pedal board is the same that we'd see John posting to his Instagram as well around this time, October of 2016. And the pedal board had the TS-10, a Pete Cornish duplex on it again, SSG2 version, as well as the JHS pedals Twin 12. So really cool we're seeing the duplex as well, kind of consistently coming back a little bit now. It's making another appearance here, and the JHS pedals Twin 12, which is a pedal I'm also very interested in and seeing John use. And from what we can tell as well, the earliest we've seen John using a JHS pedal on any board or any kind of use as well, which is pretty cool. And then on October 27th of 2016, the John Mayer Trio would get together and perform at the Apollo Theater. We also have some rehearsal footage before this performance, but the pedal board featured 2 TS-10s on it. So this is another kind of interesting case, again, bringing up that whole concept of gain stacking tube screamers for John's Overdrive sound. It's something you guys should try out and see how you like, but it's a lot more common than we kind of initially thought to see John using. So the tones from this performance were 2 tube screamers, 2 TS-10s, which is pretty cool. So now it's at this point where in 2017, the Search for Everything has released and the Search for Everything World Tour is beginning. And luckily enough, I have a pretty structured timeline in terms of the overdrive pedals John was using and the changes that we saw at this point. Now, kind of in the early stages of rehearsals for the tour, John posted a video of him dueling Isaiah Sharkey. He's got a Fender Jazzmaster. It's really, really cool. And you can see that he actually has the more traditional Bradshaw rack unit set up with the floorboard controller. And you can make out a TS10 in this rack unit shot here. But the key point here is that you can make out a Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I in the rack unit. Meaning that, if you haven't heard about this before, or seen the shot before, or from the video, or looked, we were this close to actually getting the return of the Marshall Bluesbreaker in terms of John's pedalboard setup, kind of going back to the Continuum era and what a lot of people consider the golden John Mayer overdrive tone combination of the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I and the TS10. That was in the rack unit at this point. However, John would switch from the rack unit setup to a kind of really interesting concept where the Bradshaw rig, the controller was in front of him, and the most massive controller system I think I've ever seen anyone use. And then he had two pedal boards flanking him on either side, a wet pedal board and a dry pedal board. We actually have a really amazing shot that Bradshaw himself took while he was building John's rig, and you can see on it that you have the TS10, the Klon Centaur, and then the Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin as John's third overdrive on the pedalboard during the building process. And this would continue into later rehearsals where John actually had this pedalboard setup that he could use, both pedal boards on the floor flanking the controller. Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin, Klon Centaur, and TS10 continued to be used. And for the first few shows of the Search for Everything tour, the Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin stayed on the pedal board. Now, throughout the entire Search for Everything tour, you'd see the TS10 and the Klon Centaur. Those two pedals do not change. But what sat in that third overdrive position did. So we start off with the Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin. Then we actually move on to about April, the start of April. Madison Square Garden is where this shot is specifically from. We see the Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin replaced by the Pete Cornish Duplex. Now, at this point here, I vividly remember seeing a black kind of series battery-free Pete Cornish pedal with 3 knobs being used on one of the pedal boards. Either a P1, SS2, G2, or P2, I believe, would be the 4 options you could have for that kind of setup in the black kind of battery-free Pete Cornish pedal. I can't find that specific shot, but I believe one was used at this point as well. John was experimenting with the duplex and that Pete Cornish pedal. But this was for like 1 or 2 shows. This is the level of detail I'm going into here. But Pete Cornish duplex for sure at the beginning of April. Brief interruption here, you guys. I'm coming to you from actually editing this video right now. And then looking for better footage from the 2017 World Tour to actually show you guys John soloing with what I believe would be the Cornish duplex. I found a shot from March 31st of 2017, so just a few days before that Madison Square Garden show, where the duplex was just on the board with the TS10 No Klon Centaur. I found this video here where you can actually see that the duplex is on the pedal board with the Klon Centaur. So I think end of March, it kind of looks like Cornish duplex gets added onto the pedal board. It stays there until the kind of first week of April, early April. The Klon Centaur gets removed for that Madison Square Garden shot, and I can see that because we just have that really great shot of the board from that specific show. But then kind of right away, it transitions and it moves off for what we're about to discuss coming up. But just wanted to add that point in here because I thought it was worth noting that I found another shot where you can see both the Klon and the duplex on it. And I didn't want to leave it out if we're doing as big of a deep dive as I've done. So I hope you guys are enjoying the video so far. Just wanted to make one kind of addition to the video post filming. But then by May of 2017, we see the JHS Charlie Brown version 4 being used, and this pedal would stay for quite a while on the pedal board in terms of how quickly John was actually switching things in and out. The JHS Charlie Brown V4 stayed in that third overdrive pedal position for a bit, but then by July of 2017, you actually see the Way Huge Camel Toe Mark II. Infamously, kind of from the Bud Light Dive Bar show, you get a really great shot of the pedal board with that Way Huge Camel Toe version 2, Mark II, on the pedal board, and that was kind of the primary third overdrive during the Search for Everything era. Now, what is very interesting here, remember we've talked about the concept of gain stacking tube screamers together. Well, the Way Huge Camel Toe is a red llama and a green rhino. So was John gain stacking the green rhino side into the TS10 at some points? Who knows, but it's a possibility. Now in 2018, there are a few kind of really cool performances we got from John that I want to highlight and just break down what overdrive pedals we're hearing in each one for you guys. Now, to start off, May 17th, John actually would perform with Shawn Mendes, and he would use the JHS Bonsai as his primary the only overdrive pedal he had on that really small board he brought for this performance. So just really cool to hear him use the Bonsai. There's a nice shot that John had posted to his Instagram when he first, I assume, got the Bonsai, saying every household should have one. And the mode is set to TS10, so that's pretty cool. And the Bonsai, as you guys can hear if you look up this footage, John sounds great with it. It's a really great option if you want a tube screamer that kind of has a bunch of those different ones built into it. It's a brilliant pedal. On September 22nd, we have the Bourbon and Beyond Festival. The All Along the Watchtower performance specifically is brilliant. But for overdrives, we have TS10 and Klon Centaur. Then October 24th, we have an iHeartRadio performance where John performed this really interesting concept of a solo show. And on his pedal board, he had the TS10, but no Klon Centaur, and instead he had the Shins Music Dumbleloid Twin that we saw him use during the Search for Everything era, and then a Pete Cornish pedal on it, but this is that same black enclosured battery-free version with 3 knobs on it that I was talking about earlier, and I can at least show you guys what the pedal looks like on John's board because I actually have a shot of it to show. Now, like I mentioned, it could be the G2, the SS2, P1, P2. Those are kind of the 4 options that style it could be. Now, worth noting, I just want to mention that in my mind, I vividly remember it being a G2. Take for that what you will. I can't confirm that, but in my mind, it was a G2, so I'm just throwing that out there for you guys, knowing the duplex as well had the SS2 and G2 built into it. Though it kind of looked like John was primarily using the SS2 side, it's still very likely that G2 is in the mix. So a standalone G2 version would be, I think, decently likely, and that's what at least I remember seeing it be in the shot that just, for whatever reason, just I can't find. Then lastly, as far as 2018 is concerned, we have Mac Miller's Celebration of Life. Drive pedals were TS10 and Klon Centaur. The pedal board very similarly set up to the one we saw for Bourbon and Beyond. All right, now we're moving on to 2019. We're getting through it, you guys, and this has been a long video, but really fun to kind of look back on all of John's overdrive pedals. And if you're enjoying this video and want to see me do it for like delays or fuzz pedals or something, let me know in the comments down below and I can make that happen, I'm pretty sure. So the 2019 World Tour is split up into kind of 4 sections, let's say. Rehearsals, the first leg, which was Asia, Oceania, leg 2, North America, and leg 3, Europe. Now, the rehearsal pedal board was the exact same that we'd see for the first leg of the tour. And on the pedal board here, we have the TS10, the Klon Centaur, the Zen Drive 2, the Smoky Signal tubeless overdrive pedal, and then the Blackstone Appliances MOSFET overdrive. Now, the Blackstone Appliances MOSFET, that was in a coarse drive loop with the CE2, and then John would hit a small little Keeley looper pedal to activate both of those pedals on at the same time. That was primarily used for helpless. John did use it for, I guess I just feel like, as well during rehearsals, but that was kind of live. It was used a little bit for helpless is kind of where you heard it, but it didn't seem to be something that John primarily used that much, hence why it'd be dropped by the time leg 2 came back around. But this pedal board was massive, and we have so many pedals on it. It was pretty insane, actually. And it's worth noting the appeared at least pedal board order that we have here of the Zen Drive 2 first, then the TS10, then the Klon Centaur, then the Smoky Signal tubeless, followed by the Blackstone Appliances MOSFET overdrive, again in that coarse drive loop. That's a huge kind of overdrive setup on this pedal board, and the 2019 tour as well, in terms of John's overdrive tones, is a real big favorite of mine. It's higher gain. The solos were just incredible, and just even the fact that John was touring not backing off of any album release, it kind of let him loose a little bit in his tones as well, and just the songs he wanted to perform, which I loved the whole concept of the 2019 World Tour. Again, we have that Smoky Signal tubeless making an appearance. It's kind of been around for a very long time, all the way back since kind of, the Continuum era, but this is just one pedal where I cannot provide one single example that we've seen John ever step on it or use it for 100% certainty, which really annoys me. But it's just one of those pedals that we've seen come and go, and, no context as to why John keeps coming back to this specific pedal, but he must like it and have used it at some point if it keeps making a return over a decade later at this point. The Zen Drive 2, bit of a departure from that Zen Drive 1 we saw John kind of using around the same time he started, at least that we believe he started first experimenting with the Smoky Signal during the kind of end of the Continuum era. But this time the Zen Drive 2 version with the tube in it, one of my favorite overdrive pedals of all time. Again, another one, unfortunately, I've tried to look through as much footage as there is, and I just have no actual concrete shots of John actually stepping on it. Unfortunately, that's kind of the last not the last, but one of the last big mysteries in terms of overdrive pedals that we've seen John have on a board. Now, when it comes to the North American leg of the 2019 World Tour Leg 2, John's pedal board really simplifies in terms of the overdrive setup and transitions to a 3 overdrive pedal setup predominantly. You still have the Klon Centaur and the TS10, and then you just have a 3rd overdrive pedal slot. That really was where the rest of the experimentation went with the 2019 World Tour, for the most part, at least, the primary experimentation. For the North American leg, the predominant overdrive pedal setup was that Klon Centaur, Ibanez TS10, and then the Mesa Boogie Flux 5, which is such a brilliant sounding pedal for those higher gain tones, which is really why I love the 2019 World Tour's tone so much. If you listen to Belief from any of the 2019 World Tour North American performances, odds are that intro solo and outro solo were incorporating the Mesa Boogie Flux 5, at least part of the gain stacking equation. During the North American leg as well, we also saw the introduction of the Solo Dallas Storm. The original version, John just has a limited edition kind of green marbled version of that pedal. Now, the Solo Dallas Storm, it's got such a wide range on it. John does predominantly use it as a boost pedal from what we can tell, but I'm including it in this video here just to be a bit more thorough, as well as it can get definitely into that overdrive pedal territory. And in the very best photo we have from the 2019 World Tour, we actually see that the Solo Dial Storm replaced the Klon Centaur, and then you see the Ibanez TS10 and then the Mesa Boogie Flux 5. Go figure, just on the best shot of John's board from this time, we don't actually have that Klon Centaur on it. And the Solo Dial Storm, for kind of the remainder of the 2019 World Tour, would come and go. It would replace the Keeley Katana at points. It would replace the Klon Centaur, as you can see here. It would even replace the slide rig as kind of doing all of those bit of boost functions that we see here, because even the Klon Centaur is kind of set up as that light overdrive boost sort of thing. Same thing with the slide rig. It's not adding a ton of compression. It's got a lot of boost to it too. And then of course the Keeley Katana. So it's covering kind of a lot of different functions here, but just the best shot we're seeing here just shows one example of when it just flat out replaced the Klon Centaur for one show. Now, something else that also happened during the 2019 World Tour's North American leg in St. Paul, Minnesota on August 5th, we actually see the Chase Bliss Condor make an appearance just for this one show. And in this shot here, if we really zoom in, you can actually see that the Condor was in place of the Klon Centaur. There was no Solo Dial Storm either, so the overdrive pedal setup for the St. Paul show was Chase Bliss Condor, TS10, and Mesa Boogie Flux 5. This was just one of those cases where John experimented with this pedal once, and then we never see him use it again, but still pretty cool, and just including it in our timeline. Moving along to the European leg 3 of the 2019 World Tour, we see again the Solo Dial Storm in this one shot you can see here is in place, and the Keeley Katana is actually off. The slide rig gets moved over to the right side of the wah pedal on that little riser, so the Keeley Katana is removed, still keeps the slide rig. Solo Dial Storm, Klon Centaur, Ibanez TS10, and then the Shins Music Dumbleloid B. And I think out of all the tones from the 2019 World Tour, the North American ones with the Mesa Boogie Flux 5 are brilliant, but there are just some truly incredible ones with that Shins Music Dumbleloid B, with that boost circuit in it as well. John's even just stacked both sides of that pedal alone for some really great solo tones. And I've actually made a whole video on both the use of the Mesa Boogie Flux 5 and the Shins Music Dumbleloid B tones for the 2019 World Tour, with real examples where you can see the LEDs on, John stepping on the pedals. I'll link that video in the description down below. But they're just amazing pedals and really what made the 2019 World Tour truly special. But the Shins Music Dumbleloid B, that was that third position overdrive pedal for the third leg of the 2019 World Tour. Flux 5, the Shins Music Dumbleloid B. We have quite a bit actually, enough for me to make a video on with really great footage. So the kind of key thing about the 2019 World Tour is that the Klon Centaur and the TS10, those were the two primary overdrives that you're hearing for majority of the tones. Leg 1, you hear the chorus drive loop with the Blackstone Appliances MOSFET a little bit, but not a lot. Can't pinpoint that Smoky Signal or the Zen Drive 2. But then a lot of those higher gain, think the Belief intro and outro solo. That was with the Mesa Boogie Flux 5 and the Shins Music Dumbleloid B. Moving on from the 2019 World Tour into 2020, and you guys all know what happened that year. Not really a lot to talk about. There is one standout performance on February 4th, the day before my birthday, of 2020 at the Hotel Cafe with David Ryan Harris. John performs with the Silver Sky Nebula finish for the very first time. It's an amazing solo, and his pedalboard setup was very simple into a vintage Fender Vibreverb. He just had the TS10. That was the overdrive that you were hearing for that performance. Now, before we get into the Sob Rock era, there's one performance at the start of 2021 on January 14th, and it was for the Grammys with Maren Morris performing Bones. On John's pedalboard, he had that blacked out Klon Centaur, the TS10, and the solo Dallas Storm, and this is the last time, at least at the time of me making this video, that we've seen John with the solo Dallas Storm. Then we move on into Sob Rock, and we have some changes as well, and some very interesting things happen. And of course, this is very much modern John Mayer era at this point. Now, Sob Rock, we have some television promotional performances that John would perform. I believe it was at Henson Studios. He recorded all of them kind of back to back. And he had what was a smaller version of a pedal board, kind of almost a B-rig. It wasn't like a large touring pedal board that he used for these performances. And on the pedal board, we have the TS10, but instead of the Klon Centaur, we have the J-Rocket Jeff Beck Archer. The very first and really only kind of context we've seen John using a clone of the Klon Centaur being this kind of B-rig that he had during the Sob Rock era with the Jeff Mod Archer. And it kind of makes sense. Jeff Beck was clearly a hero of John's, so for him to use a pedal that was essentially, from my understanding, a one-to-one of Jeff Beck's actual Klon as a Klon Centaur style pedal on his board, it kind of makes sense for John to use that pedal. So we see that being used for those kind of early Sob Rock television performances of Last Train Home, Wild Blue, songs like that. And then we move on to the actual Sob Rock tour in 2022, and we have the Palladium show, which opened up this entire tour, which was really exciting, kind of the first night of the whole tour, and we saw John switch to a more traditional pedal board. Now, throughout kind of modern-ish Maritimes, Born and Raised Paradise Valley, all the way up into kind of, the 2019 World Tour, a huge debate between Mayer fans, or a common question that would get asked, is TS10 into Klon Centaur or Klon Centaur into TS10? Because we've seen John doing both of these things throughout this timeline. During the Sob Rock era, John kind of put that debate to rest because he gave himself the option to do either or. Because for the Sob Rock pedal board, it started off as Ibanez TS10 into Klon Centaur into TSV 808, which, even though it's not technically a TS10, it's still Tube Screamer into Klon Centaur into Tube Screamer, and the TSV 808, that was out of left field. I remember seeing right after the Palladium show, I got a dead-on shot of John's pedal board, and I was like, whoa, I did not expect that at all. So John had that pedal on his pedal board, and then for the tour, we would see John also adding the Function Effects third rail Overdrive. The third rail was primarily used, from what I can tell, for gain stacking along with a bunch of other things. The psychedelic fuzz amplifier machine for I Guess I Just Feel Like, as part of that large chain. That's primarily what the third rail was used for. The TSV, that's the one other pedal where I've seen zero footage of John using it. I highly theorize that the Belief tone, the intro of Belief for the Palladium show, was with the TSV, because that just sounded unlike really any other tone we heard all night from that performance, because it was professionally recorded. So I heavily theorize that that was included, at least in part of the chain, the TSV 808 at the very end of it, whether it was TS10, Klon Centaur, TSV, or just Klon TSV, or TS10 TSV, but I highly theorize the TSV was included in the equation for at least that tone, because it was so incredible sounding. It was absolutely brilliant. But it would get dropped for the 10 years of the Decade Overdrive pedal. And the Decade was, again, another one that was pretty much out of left field, based off that really small amplifier. Think of Joshua Home with Queens of the Stone Age. That's what heavily associate that guitar kind of tone with. But that was mainly used for Last Train Home, from some footage we've seen as well. Very interesting, that choice being added in there. John, of course, recorded the solo of Last Train Home with a Soldano SLO amplifier, so maybe he was trying to go with something a little bit, kind of more in that kind of vein to stack with, who knows, but that's kind of what John was using. So TSV was there for a while, then replaced with the 10 years a decade, but the mainstays were TS10 into Klon Centaur, and that was primarily what you heard for the Sob Rock era tones. It was primarily TS10 into Klon Centaur for those drive tones. A little bit of use of the Function Effects third rail and the 10 years a decade we have footage of as well.
It was just another night.
And in 2022, there's one show that I definitely have to mention, and it's on June 3rd at the Troubadour with David Ryan Harris. We have one of the clearest shots of John's pedalboard we've ever gotten, thanks to my friend Gabe Bergman. And you can see here a really just up close look at that blacked out Klon Centaur with the TS10 on the pedalboard. And as I mentioned earlier, John had that B-Rig pedalboard as well that was very similar to what we saw him using for the Sob Rock promotional performances. Also, as far as the drives are concerned, they stayed the same, being that Jeff modded Archer from J-Rocket, and then the TS10. And one of my favorite performances from the Sob Rock era was actually not even one of John's songs. It was the cover of Everyone Wants to Rule the World with Alexander 23, and John was using those two pedals for his lead tone. Absolutely incredible. I think I just said everyone wants to rule the world. It's everybody wants to rule the world. We're getting near the end of it, and my brain's getting a little fried going through the entire timeline here. It's a long video. 2023 rolls around now. We're pretty much at the end, and there are two kind of separate things happen in 2023. We have some John Mayer Trio performances, and we have the solo tour. Now, discussing the solo tour first, we have the kind of same concept of Tube Screamer into Klon Centaur into Tube Screamer, but instead we drop the TSV for another TS10. So we have TS10 into Klon Centaur into TS10. And that is something we'd actually see stay consistent with the John Mayer Trio performances that went throughout 2023 as well. In both cases, we saw John actually using that combination. And for the John Mayer Trio, for example, John actually performing some of those lead tones, he would stack on TS10 into Klon Centaur into TS10. That's actually what you end up hearing, which is pretty cool to see. And I'll throw up some footage of John doing just that with the John Mayer Trio in 2023. Now, there is one more performance in 2023 that I do feel like we should talk about, and it's from the Power of Love Gala on February 18th. Now, the reason why this, I think, is valid in the discussion is because the pedalboard featured the blacked out Klon Centaur, the Ibanez TS10, but also that white 10 Years the Decade pedal, which we saw John using during the Sob Rock era. So that did transition off of that pedalboard onto another one. So the fact that the 10 Years a Decade we've seen actually get used in a different context than just strictly during the Sob Rock era, I think is worth adding in here into our timeline.
Everyone know me, then you gotta know me through and through. And if you're gonna hurt me, then you gotta hold me next to you. Yeah. No matter how you feel.
And that concludes John Mayer's Overdrive history and the timeline. Like I said, I didn't include absolutely everything, every single performance, but I really tried to hit a lot of the highlights throughout the years. Of course, the mainline tours as well, just gotta be included in any conversation around John's Overdrive history, but I did my best to kind of really touch on a lot of those sought after and notable performances throughout the years and in between eras as well. If at this point you're wondering, well, wait, where was Dead & Company when we kind of hit that time frame? 2015, I believe, is when Dead & Company started. I consider Dead & Company and John's solo career, John's main career, the tones we know John of, to be, they're in my mind, they're two completely separate things. I could have added Dead & Company into the mix, but then we would have been here, you know, quite a lot longer because there was a lot of changes and a lot of Dead & Company tours throughout the years. I could do a Dead & Company history video, maybe separately. If you guys want to see that video come out, let me know in the comments down below. But I consider that and John's kind of solo career two different things. And to keep the timeline clean, I wanted to just keep it, you know, let's just discuss John's actual main career here apart from Dead & Company in this video. So I hope you guys understand why I left it out of this one. we would have been here a lot longer too. If you guys enjoyed the video, please give it a like and let me know your thoughts on all this in the comments down below. Like I said, if there was a performance I left out, let me know in the comments down below. You know, like I said, probably a pretty good reason why I might have skipped over it, or just for time's sake, I didn't want to include too many for you guys. But if you stuck with me to the very end, I really appreciate you. Thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll see you on the next video.